Hey everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial from the Electronic Armory. I'm your Electronic Armorer for Android, and today we're going to take a look at launching another activity in your Android application. This is useful if you're trying to show a different screen based on a user tapping a button or something similar. Let's talk about what's required to do that. In order for Android to launch your second activity, we'll tell Android OS that you intend to do this. This is where intents come in. We have explicit intents and we have implicit intents. To launch a second activity, we'll use explicit intents, which just means that we're going to tell the Android operating system which activity to launch explicitly. With implicit intents, we instead tell Android a general description of what we intend to do. For example, we may intend to show an activity with a camera so we can have our users take a photo. We don't tell Android which activity to launch, it'll figure that out for us. So that's why it's called implicit. Alright. In order to show you how we use intents, I'm going to start a new project called Intents. I'm going to select all the defaults and click Finished. Alright, Android Studio starts us off with our basic view of our application, and I'm going to go ahead and select a small button to put here, and I'm just going to drag it into the center. I'm going to give it a name, and for this I'm going to call Details. And what I want to do for this is I want to press the button and have that launch our new activity. So this is going to be a main parent view, and by clicking on this button, it'll show us details of the activity that we're viewing. I'm going to rename this button Details Button, hit Enter. I'm going to select this text here and just change it to Main Activity. Okay, so in order to launch a second activity, we have to create a second activity. So to do that, we go to our Android files, go up to Java, select our package. This can be done in a number of ways, but the way that I like to do it is just right-click on it, go to New, select Activity, and choose from one from the list. I'm just going to choose Blank Activity, and it's going to ask me for a name, and it's automatically going to just say Main 2, but I want to call this Details Activity. And Android Studio will name the other fields automatically for you. This checkbox here, Launcher Activity, will set this activity to be the launched activity or the beginning activity when your application launches. You can also choose to use a fragment with this activity, though for sake of simplicity, we're just going to leave this unchecked for now. Okay, and here's our second activity. I'm going to drag in a plain text view in the center here and call it Second Activity. Perfect, and we're done. So let's go back to our Android coding files, click on Main Activity. Okay, and what we want to do on our main activity is when the user clicks on that Details button, we want to have a click listener that listens for that click, and when that click happens, to create an intent and then tell that intent which activity we want to launch and then launch that activity. So let's get started. So we need to get a reference to our Details button. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a member in my class called Details button, and that is of type button. Details button. Now Android Studio is telling me that it cannot find this class that I've entered, namely button, and it can auto import that for me under the package android.widget.button. And to do that, hit Option Enter. By clicking on Imports, I can see the packages that I'm importing. At the very bottom, we can see android.widget.button, which is what we just imported. Okay, now that we have the member in our class, we can then use that and get a reference and assign it to that variable. So Details button, and we're going to set that to a reference to our button, and the way that we get that is we use the find view by ID and we pass it the ID that we set up in our interface builder. That method returns a view object which we will then typecast into a button and assign it to this variable. And the ID that we gave it is in the R class under the IDs dot Details button. And again, this matches the name that we gave it in our interface builder. Conclude that with a semicolon, and now we have a reference to our Details button that we can use later in our code. We now set our onClick listener for our Details button by set onClick listener and passing in a new onClick listener. Now that we have our onClick listener, we can create our intent and then use that to launch our second activity. So to create our intent, we simply create a variable, intent, import the package by pressing Option Enter, give it a name, and I'm going to call this Details Intent to let it know that we're launching the Details activity. Set that equal to a new instance of intent, and because this is an explicit intent, we want to send it the package context and the class to launch, namely our second activity. So the package context is usually the activity or context that is launching this intent. So in this case, it's main activity.this. The second parameter is the activity that we actually want to create. But we don't do this manually. We actually let the Android operating system, namely the activity manager, to do this for us. All we need to do is pass this intent just enough information for it to create the activity for us. And the way that we do that is detailsActivity.class. And that'll give a class reference to this intent so the activity manager can create this for us. And now the next thing we want to do is actually launch this activity. Or what we're really doing is telling the activity manager to do this for us. And the way that we do this is start activity, and we pass it the intent. So that's all there really is to it. Again, we're creating a button, getting a reference to it, and using a button click to launch our second activity. To launch that second activity, we're creating an intent, passing it the context, main activity.this, giving it enough detail to launch our details activity, detailsActivity.class, and then using that intent to start the activity by calling start activity and passing it the intent. Let's go ahead and run this. Alright, so you can see that we have our main activity displayed with our details button. By clicking the button, it should launch our second activity. And there we go. It launched our second activity. Now to go back, one of the best practices to do is to use the hardware back button, in this case the triangle that's pointing back to the left in the lower left-hand corner. And that returns to our main activity. We can again click on the details button to launch our second activity, and click the back button to go back. Alright, that's great, but kind of boring. So what happens if we want to send information back and forth between our two activities? One of the easiest ways is to actually use the intent to bundle up information and send it back and forth. So let's take a look and see how we send information to our second activity. Looking at the code that we used to create our intent, we can wrap up the information that we want to display in the intent in what's called a bundle. That bundle is put in the intent's extras, and that extras can then be extracted by the second activity. So let's take a look at how we do this. We're going to use the details intent and put an extra string value in the intent's bundle extras so that we can pass it to the second activity. And for this, we put extra, and these are a bunch of overloaded methods that we can just put a key value pair in. So the key is going to be a string, and the value can be a boolean, another bundle, a byte, a character sequence, a double, a float, an int, a long, and something called a parsable. A parsable is going to be a little bit more complex data that you want to put in. As you've noticed from the above types, they're very basic types. We also have serializable. These are objects or class instances that implement the serializable interface. If you need to pass more complex data, you can look at the serializable interface in order to pass your own custom classes in through the putExtra method. The one that we're interested in is just a regular string value. So the putExtra method is looking for a key, and again, this is just a string, so we're going to call it extras key. I'm going to put it all in capital letters. In order to pull it out in our second activity, we need to use this string key to access our information. So in our second activity, you have to type in this string exactly as it appears here. If you misspell it, you're not going to get anything back. So this is going to be a bug that the compiler can't catch. So a cool Android Studio trick is to highlight the string, right-click on it, go down to Refactor, over to Extract, and down to Constant. This is going to extract this as a constant, put it inside your class, and make it a public static final string called extras key with a value of extras key. Now the key value doesn't actually matter, it just has to be unique when using keys so it doesn't collide with other keys that are in your extras bundle. So this looks good, so I'm going to hit enter. If I scroll up, you can see that it put that variable at the top of my screen. I can access this constant from my second class because this is a public static string, and anything public I can access from another class. So let's finish up putting our extra data in our intent. So the second parameter is the value itself. In this case, I'm just going to pass in a string. And that's all we have to do to put a little bit of extra data in the intent so that the second activity can access that. So let's write the code so the second activity can get to this extra data. We do that in the details activity, and we can do this in the onCreate method because when the activity is created, we want to pull that extra data out of the intent and use it in our interface. So the way that we do that is we get the intent that was used to create this activity, and from that intent, we get the extras bundle. So I'm going to create a variable called extras of type bundle in order to store that. And again, we get the extras from our intent, and the way that we get our intent is simply get intent. This method passes back the intent that launched this activity, and from here we can get the extras out of it by getting extras. Get extras. And now we have a reference to the extras that we put all of our values into. Now in order to get those values out, we need to use that key that we created and made a constant and use that to access the information. And that information that we used was a string, so we're going to use the key in our main activity to pull that out of our extras bundle and assign it to a string variable. Now the way that we get the value out of our extras bundle is to get that key. And the value is a string, so we want to get string and pass it in the key. That key comes from our main activity and is declared as a public static string, and we can access it from our main activity class. And voila, we're extracting that string from our extras bundle using the key that we used to insert it in the extras bundle in the first place. So now our extras string variable should represent what we typed in our first activity. Now let's use this extra string variable and assign this to the text view that we have on our second activity's layout. In our layout called Content Details, I'm going to change the ID for our text view manually. Okay, so I named it Second Activity Text View. Copy that and go back to my Details activity. Now that that text view has an ID, we can get a reference to it and set the text for it. The text we're going to set is the value of the extra string that we pulled out of the bundle. And paste in that ID that we copied from our layout. Now that we have a reference to it, we can set the text for it. So there we have it. Again, we're using an intent that we created in the first activity to bundle up information, launch that second activity, and in that second activity, getting the intent that launched it, getting the extras from that intent, pulling our value out as a string using the key that we used to define to put it in the first place, and then using that string to set a user interface element on our screen, namely a text view. Let's go ahead and run this and see how it works. Okay, here's our main activity. If we click on Details, you can see that our text view is now changed to this is the extra data. All right, well, what if you wanted to pass in user information rather than hard-coded data? We're going to get the user input from an edit text field that we're going to put on the main activity and then pass that value to our second activity. So let's set that up. Go over to Content Main, drag in a plain text view. Now I want the width to fill its parent view, which will result in the text view taking up the full width of the screen. Go over to Layout Width, drop this little arrow down, and say Fill Parent. Now you can see where I drop that, there's a green dotted line that goes down to the Details button. When I drop this in, I made this edit text relative to the Details button. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to drag this over to the left and have it take up the full screen. If you don't get the layouts right the first time, play around with it a little bit. When in doubt, just delete it and start over again. Like all user interface elements that we want to manipulate in code, we have to give it an ID. So I called this extras text, and in our main activity, when we click that details button, we want to take the value out of that edit text field and put it in our extras instead of the hard-coded text. So to do that, we get a reference to it, we get the text out of it, and then we pass it into the extras. For our edit text, we use the getText method, but that passes back an object. We call toString on that to actually put it to a string. And now we replace the hard-coded string with the string from our edit text. And that's all we have to do. Let's give it a try. Okay, we have our main activity, and you can see that our cursor is put in our edit text already, so let's just type something in. Hitting the details button, you can see that it took the text from our edit text, passed it into the intent, our second activity pulled that string out of our intent, and populated our interface. But what about the other way around? What about sending information from our second activity back to our main activity? Let's take a look at that. All right, so we want to send information from our second activity back to our first activity. So to do that, we're going to go to our second activity, our details activity, and add two buttons. And depending upon which button is selected, we'll send back different information. So I'm going to drop in two buttons. Name this button Start. And this one Stop. Now when the user selects one of these buttons, Start or Stop, we want to tell the main activity which button was selected. So in our details activity, we set up our click listeners for both buttons, Okay, now that we have our start and stop button on click listener set, we're going to create a new intent to return information back to the main activity. So create a new intent, import the package. I like to call this return intent. And because we're not launching an activity, you don't have to fill in anything in the constructor. Package the extras just as you did with the first activity. We're going to use this intent to set the result for this activity to pass it back to the main activity. This setResult method is asking for two parameters. One is the result code and the intent data. The first one is just a constant that we can put in. So you can see the choices here. We can have it say canceled or OK. You can choose to use these values in your main activity or just ignore them. I'm going to just do OK because it's not really a cancel, and pass in the return intent. I'm going to copy and paste this code below. Okay, now you can see each click listener is going to pass back a different set of data. Now this will work fine, but if you want those buttons to actually close that second activity, we have to call finished. By calling finish, it'll kill that second activity and return to the first one. Alright, and now you might be wondering how that first activity gets the data from that second activity's intent. There's a method that's a callback that's in the activity class that we use to override it and get that information out. That one's called onActivityResult. And now that's the only thing you have to remember because Android Studio allows us to auto-generate those overrided methods. So hit Command-N or Control-N on Windows, go down to Override Methods, hit Enter, and start typing in onActivityResult. Keep typing until you see onActivityResult and hit Enter. Android Studio will auto-create this method for us and highlight the first line so that as we start typing, it'll delete this code for us. As you can see in the parameters, it's giving us a request code, a result code, which we passed in as OK, and the intent data that we're looking for. So we need to make sure that the data is not null, because if we try to extract information from it, we're going to get a null pointer exception. Now that we know the data is not null, we can pull the extras out of it. And we pull it out the same way that we do in our first activity as we did in our second activity. And now I'm going to set the details button in our first activity to the value of this string. So our details button on return from our second activity should say either stop or start. OnActivityResult will get called when our second activity finishes. We have to tell the second activity that we're expecting a result from it. So to do that, when we start the activity, we have to let the second activity know by calling startActivity4Result. So up here, we call startActivity for result. We pass it the intent and a request code. You can use that result code in the below method onActivityResult, and you can see it's being passed in as a parameter. In our case, we don't really use it, so we're just going to keep it as 0. If you had multiple activities launching and returning data, you might want to know which activities those are and give it a request code so that when it comes back, you can filter out those activities based on that request code. So for example, maybe for launching a camera, you can have that request code be 100, whereas a second activity can just be 1. The numbers are arbitrary, they're up to you. If your onActivityResult is not getting called, make sure you have it startActivity4Result. This is a common mistake with starting secondary activities. Let's go ahead and launch it. In our main activity, type some text. Hit the details button. Now instead of hitting stop or start, hit the back button. You can see that our details button still says details. Hit details again, and now hit one of the two buttons. We hit start and you can see that our details button says start. Hit the start button and hit the stop button. So now you can see that we're passing back information from the second activity back into the first. With the first, we're passing in some text from an edit text field, passing that to the second activity and displaying it in an interface. And then depending upon which button we select in that second activity, we're passing that information back to the first activity and changing another interface element there. Now this is a pretty simple example, but with these simple tools, you're able to create some pretty complex interfaces. Now if you have any questions about that, leave those in the comment below. If you like this video, like it. If you want to see more, subscribe. Please join us next time for more Android development tutorials, as well as other tutorials on iOS, 3D, electronics, software development, and more. Thanks.